Moving on, we have Destruction Derby 1. For the rest of these, I think we'll stick with the default Warp Star. We already saw a Destruction Derby, so the basic rule set is unchanged between the different modes. The only difference is the stage itself. So we have like a nighttime stage, kind of with the Celestial Valley aesthetic. The music is also the same, and this is also a good time to mention that a lot of the music in Kirby Air Ride, specifically a lot of the event music, but also the Checker Night song, which is also used for this mode, a lot of the songs actually originate from the Japanese version of the Kirby anime, known internationally as Kirby Right Back Atcha, but in Japan was called Hoshi no Kabi, or Kirby of the Stars. It's very interesting that that actually released slightly before Kirby Air Ride, so this was kind of like a cross-promotion. But again, that's actually fairly obscure given that like a lot of 4Kids productions, the dub had a different soundtrack compared to the original Japanese version. So we wouldn't have actually have heard these songs in the original Kirby anime, unfortunately. So again, the Checker Night song is a good example of that, but again, a lot of the event songs throughout the city also count for this. In general, again, Destruction Derby is not one of my better modes. We're definitely struggling quite a bit here, but again, I'm not overly shocked by that. I'm also kind of not playing well myself, falling into the pit multiple times, so I'm pretty sure there is actually a checklist requirement for actually breaking the barriers to the pits. In general, I feel like the Gordos are some of the strongest, and you actually do have to get a certain amount of KOs to unlock the next stage, ranging between 5 and 10, depending on the stage. Next, we have Destruction Derby 2. This stage is kind of interesting in terms of its layout because it's basically a giant ring. So basically we have very narrow choke points. So obviously items like Gordos are very efficient because there's not a lot of room to maneuver here. So it's very easy to rack up KOs like this. Again, trying to actually get 10 KOs is surprisingly difficult for me personally, though again, in my case I'm also just bad at the combat in this game, especially without copy abilities and upgrades. If you want to complete the checklist, it's worth mentioning that the records don't count city trial records, obviously, because you can obviously get really absurd stats and also the legendary air ride machines, and can kind of breeze past a lot of the records. But for the actual checklist, I think it will count plays through city trials. So for example, with the air glider mode, if you just have the Dragoon, you can actually meet the requirements very easily, but that record won't actually count for the records portion in terms of like high scores. It will only count for the checklist, again, as far as I can recall. Again, I actually do really enjoy City Trial partly because of the randomness of the events, and honestly, it's kind of a shame that very few other games have attempted this mode. I can only think of one other example, and it's another Sakurai game. It's the Smash Run mode from Super Smash Bros. For Nintendo 3DS, which is basically the Smash Bros. Equivalent of this, where you have to level up and then compete in a special round with your powered-up character. But again, it's kind of a shame. Next up, we have Destruction Derby 3. This stage is very interesting because we actually have these switches that will raise and lower parts of the stage, so it can definitely make the terrain a little bit more dynamic. It's also a lot more open than 2, so it tends to be a little bit more traditional in terms of like an arena-based mode. In general, Needle is also a fairly good choice because if you mash A, you can actually rack up damage very quickly. We might be taking advantage of this in a bit with a different mode, a slightly different mode. But again, we also have these other items too, like this is a slowdown item similar to the one in the top right mode, but we also have an item that will actually lock our boost ability. Some of these actually do come into play with the City Trial mode. For example, there's a very fast boost as well, and there is actually a rule set or a random event where the air raid machines basically get supercharged and you basically lose control. But again, there are actually a ton of events, and it's unfortunate that we didn't really see many of them. Like, obviously you have the rail stations catching on fire, but you also have like Tack, the cat from Superstar, showing up to basically hoard items, and defeating them will cause them to drop everything they have. You can also encounter Dynablade, and obviously she can deal damage, but you can also attack her to cause her to drop upgrades. There's also like a fog setting that makes it harder to see where you're going, along with like restoration areas for health appearing, so there's a lot of variation within the City Trial mode itself. Our final Destruction Derby is Destruction Derby 4. This one takes place in a slightly different part of the city and ends up being a lot more claustrophobic. I feel kind of like Destruction Derby 2 because of all these buildings getting in the way. But again, within the city itself, you also have a ton of other things, like falling meteors that can deal damage, obviously. You also have various item properties too, like items can start bouncing, or there can actually be fake items that kind of look like the upgrade patches, but will actually also level down your stats or deal damage. You can also find things like a giant pillar from time to time, and breaking that will cause a ton of items to drop. And another very rare event is actually a UFO that if you land on top of it, you can actually find rare items, including one that's like a circle that actually is an all upgrade that upgrades every stat at once instead of just one individually. So again, there's a lot of variation within City Trial itself, and again, that's why I wish there was an option to increase the frequency of events instead of just a binary on-off toggle, because I definitely wish we had seen more events, and again, that's part of the reason why I recommend the 7-minute setting, just to have more time to actually explore and for crazy events to actually take place. This is not going great so far. I wasn't expecting this round to go particularly well, to be honest, but again, I do find this map to be a little bit tricky because of how closed off a lot of routes are and trying to basically find everyone else in time. Another type of stadium event is actually single lap versions of all of the main tracks. Obviously, we won't be showing these off because there's not really a point if we don't have upgrades to make them particularly different, but it's interesting to see elements of Air Ride incorporated into this mode. So that means our final stadium event is versus King Dedede. As the name implies, the goal in this mode is to defeat King Dedede using copy abilities and other attacks like the Quick Spin. This mode is very luck-based depending on which items will actually appear. Sword appearing is actually pretty good. If we actually don't win this, that's fine. I'm not going to spend too much time on this just because it is so luck-based. Again, like Fire isn't the best, but obviously Needle, again, is the best because if you get Needle, you can just spam A and deal a ton of damage very quickly. Dedede's hammer deals a ton of damage to you, so you want to be careful to stay behind him, because otherwise you will basically go down maybe 2 hits. He's that strong. And also you do have a 1.5-minute time limit similar to the Destruction Derby mode, so again, it's a bit luck-based and having to just hope that you get an item you can actually work with. And we are not, so this is not great. Like the Kirby's, Dedede will start flashing red once he's low in health, which basically means we are not doing super great at this. We are not having good luck with items in terms of stuff we can actually work with to deal damage quickly. So again, this mode can go really quickly if you can get something like Needle right away. Obviously you can finish this in like under 10 seconds even, but obviously you are at the mercy of the game's willingness to give you an item you can actually use. So again, we're not going to spend too much time on this just because I don't know how many attempts it'll actually take to win, but again, it's kind of like the Destruction Derby, just with a boss fight. So that was a quick look at all of the stadium modes. Next up, I do want to take some time to show off Free Run because there's actually an exclusive vehicle, the Flight Warp Star. The Flight Warp Star is only accessible through this mode by default. I assume you could probably add it into other modes through like modding, but in the base game, this is the only way to actually use this vehicle. It's basically the standard Warp Star, except I'm pretty sure it's slightly faster and also has much better gliding to allow you to tour the city a lot more easily. So basically, like with other free run modes, this is a great way to kind of scope out various areas, and the Flight Warp Star is a great candidate to help you get around the city a lot more efficiently to try to figure out where certain landmarks are and how to get to certain areas. In this underground area in Free Run, we also have access to every other air ride machine as well, including the legendary ones if you unlock them. So to demonstrate the Hydra, it actually doesn't move on its own unless you charge it up all the way. Once you do charge it up though, it is absurdly fast and arguably one of the best vehicles in the game, but again, it's a little bit tricky to get used to because of its unusual like startup time in terms of having to actually charge it, unlike a lot of the other vehicles. We're actually going to dismount because we're really far away from the others. I think it'll be faster on foot than to actually charge it up all the way again. But the final machine I wanted to highlight is the Dragoon over here, which is my preferred of the legendary air ride machines. It is pretty fast on the ground, but once you get into the air, you can glide incredibly quickly. So I always preferred this one of the two because it's a little bit more user-friendly in my opinion. But that was a quick look at the free run mode and the final air ride machines. Finally, I wanted to go through the records options. We already saw the best records gradually as we went through all the stadium events, but obviously we want to spend some time with the checklist. One interesting difference in this particular mode is you might have noticed the first panel involved actually unlocking the Dragoon for free run. Basically, you have to actually complete 3 other squares to actually unlock the individual parts of the Hydra and the Dragoon within the checklist, and once you unlock those 3 checkboxes, then you'll unlock the Dragoon and Hydra for free run. You can also unlock Deity and Meta Knight in free run as well, but unfortunately you can't really use them in the other modes, like Stadium. And it's also worth mentioning that for like some of the drag race modes, you do have to meet certain times to actually unlock the subsequent event, kind of like the other modes as well that we talked about. Again, like before, we do have like other boxes to actually just check off whichever ones you want, but again, those will always be purple and will not turn gold if you actually end up using those. There's one part of the Hydra, for example, within the checklist. But again, it is very interesting how much music was used in the Kirby anime first, and it's also worth mentioning that that was actually my introduction to Kirby. Because it always aired before Sonic X, I ended up seeing a little bit of the Kirby anime, and then not long after I ended up getting this game, and also starting to watch Kirby Right Back At Ya. So again, it's a game I have a ton of nostalgia for, but it's also one that I fully admit is not the best in terms of like a well-rounded experience, partly just because I definitely do feel like Top Ride and Air Ride are just kind of okay, kind of slow-paced modes, while City Trial has a lot more replayability because of the random element, along with the modularity of being able to customize different machines in certain ways to try to spec out a machine for a specific challenge. It's also worth mentioning that sometimes you will get little news broadcasts, like the random events, that'll actually just clue you in to what the actual final challenge will be, but sometimes these are actually misleading. So you basically have to be on your toes for everything. Obviously, you can target a specific type of vehicle spec, or you can try to tailor it to a well-rounded vehicle. So again, there are a lot of different approaches to this, and again, having health enabled means you can actually deal a ton of damage and try to like defeat your opponents and steal their patches, and as a result, there tends to be a lot of variety to this. And again, with a full group of people, I do feel like Kirby Air Ride would be a really fun game. As someone who's never really been able to play this with other people, I still enjoy the City Trial a lot for what it is, but again, I do feel like with a full group of people, this would be a lot more enjoyable. Also, there is alternate music for the city, though it's not based on any prior Kirby game song. It's also worth mentioning that there is LAN capabilities, like you might have noticed a LAN option on the the main menu, you can actually hook up 4 GameCubes with broadband adapters in order to actually give each person their own screen for Air Ride and City Trial. Though unlike a game like Double Dash, you're still limited to 4 players, unfortunately. To be honest, I definitely wish you could have more people, and frankly, like an online-enabled, like 8-player City Trial would honestly make for a really good, like, standalone spin-off experience. And it's kind of a shame, again, other than Smash Run, there really hasn't been any other attempt to replicate what City Trial set out to do. But like before, we do have a specialized ending for this mode. And with that, I think we've just about reached the end of this playthrough. Again, I did want to mention the LAN option on the main menu, but again, I've actually never tried that for obvious reasons, but I imagine that'd be a lot of fun. But again, it was actually a lot of fun revisiting this game. Again, I have a lot of nostalgia for this, as this was my first Kirby game, and even though I definitely admit that the first 2 modes are definitely a little bit slow-paced and not the most spectacular, I definitely still enjoyed the game a lot, for City Trial especially. And again, it is a shame that they never tried to capitalize on that with like a standalone release or even incorporating similar concepts into other releases. But that about does it for this playthrough, so with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for something new.